It's Wednesday, October 29th, Thursday the 30th in the Philippines, and we've got a couple of systems to discuss today. We've got Hurricane Melissa sitting over the southeastern Bahamas. Forecast to bring hurricane force winds there for the rest of the day today as it begins to race off to the northeast, where we'll likely bring hurricane force winds to Bermuda going into Thursday and Friday. And in the Western Pacific, we've got an invest 98W sitting in the Philippine Sea, likely to form over the next few days and could threaten the Philippines next week as a typhoon as it tracks towards the west. We'll talk about this system at the end. I'll leave a timestamp to this if you want to skip ahead to that part of the video. But we're going to start off with Hurricane Melissa in the Atlantic. And starting off with conditions in the islands further south for Cuba, Hispaniola, and Jamaica. The hurricane is now beginning to accelerate faster off to the northeast. And while we may have some outer bands still rotate into Hispaniola and Cuba throughout the night tonight, that becomes much less of a probability as the system continues tracking towards the northeast. So going into Thursday, conditions will improve markedly across Hispaniola and Cuba. And today in Jamaica, they have been markedly better from where they were yesterday. And hopefully everybody is safe and recovery is fairly swift across those islands. However, the pictures we're seeing as Jamaica especially are absolutely catastrophic where the eyeball came through, which unfortunately was expected with the Category 5 force winds that came through there. Moving into the future of the hurricane, it is beginning to race off to the northeast in acceleration as a trough over the southeast U.S. begins to pick it up. Now, right now, it's not moving all too fast. You can see it's kind of just crawling here northeast across the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos. And for that reason, we're going to have continued hurricane force winds throughout the night tonight and into early on Thursday. But going beyond that, the system might have a chance to slightly re-intensify in its winds before it reaches cooler waters. If we look at water vapor imagery, we can see that there is likely some southwesterly shear impacting the vortex here because you can see some of these cloud elements near central Cuba being pushed off to the northeast. And there is a bit of a sharp cutoff of the convection on this western side. Now, something to note is that with this trough that's picking it up, it's enhancing some of the subtropical jet stream flow across the western Atlantic. And so this hurricane is now tapping into that, and so it may help to negate some of the negative impacts of this southwesterly shear. And so we may try to see the system intensify a little bit. Now, I don't think it's going to be able to intensify much at all. One, because the system is so large now. Again, you can see in the recon data, the hurricane force wind field has grown significantly, and larger hurricanes will tend to struggle to intensify more. But also, the system does not have a lot of time over very warm ocean waters anymore. Benefit of us being in late October is that the waters across the western Atlantic are cooling off rapidly. And so you'll see that right now it's over 27 to 28 degrees Celsius waters, but as it tracks towards the northeast, it quickly finds itself into pretty cool waters. And by the time it gets to Bermuda, which is up here, it ends up in waters that are too cold to support a hurricane. So no matter how much intensification we see over the next, say, 12 to 18 hours as it sits over this warm water, it will be weakening by the time it makes its closest approach to Bermuda. Now, something that we have seen over the past day is further trends towards the west in the exact track of the hurricane. You'll see that Bermuda is here, and the center of the storm on this model is now tracking further west. This is different to a few days ago where models had expected the core of the system to come directly over the island. However, something to note is that this probably does not make all too much of a difference for the impact. In fact, it might make it worse for Bermuda, because if we look at the wind field surrounding this storm, again, you'll see that the system has grown in size. And as it comes north, hurricanes tend to gain size as they gain latitude. And so the system's wind field will gain more size as it nears Bermuda. And alongside that, with the southwesterly shear vector, a lot of the strongest winds and showers and thunderstorms are going to be pushed onto the eastern side of the hurricane. So even though the core may not come through the island directly, and we may not get a landfall in Bermuda, the wind field or the eastern side is going to be a pretty nasty side to deal with. Now, a benefit is as the system is accelerating by this point, it's going to be a pretty brisk movement as it comes through here. So we're not going to be looking at a long drawn out event like we just are having today with the Bahamas. We're probably going to see this come in, be a nasty night tomorrow night into early Friday. But as you go into Friday afternoon, the hurricane has now moved very far away from the island, and conditions get very much better from where they were on early Friday morning. And by this point, the system is becoming post-tropical, and it may get close to Newfoundland in Atlantic Canada. One aspect about this westward shift is it does mean that it gets closer to Canada as it recurves into the far North Atlantic. Now, one benefit as well with Newfoundland is the shape of the wind field. You can see all the strongest winds are kept onto the eastern side. That holds true from when it's on closest approach to Bermuda. So we may not get the strongest winds, but it could still be, some pretty breezy and nasty conditions going into Saturday across Newfoundland as this low continues tracking into the far North Atlantic. And that's exactly what's shown here on the Hurricane Center forecast. You can see again, hurricane warnings in place for the Bahamas and Cuba naturally. We'll likely see the hurricane warnings in Cuba be dropped later today. And then accelerating off to the northeast of the hurricane warning in effect now for Bermuda. That just got updated this afternoon. And then turning post-tropical, not a tropical cyclone anymore, interacts with very cold waters here, very close to Atlantic Canada, but could still have some pretty potent winds. You can see this H here highlighting hurricane force winds in the forecast as opposed to tropical cyclone. And so if it does, deviate a little bit further west, we may get some of those stronger winds on shore, and that could mean, again, a pretty nasty Friday night into Saturday there for that part of the forecast. And the good news is that after Melissa, at least for the next week, things are quiet across the Atlantic. We are getting to that time of year now where November is the last month of hurricane season, and climatologically speaking, hurricane activity drops off a lot by this time of year. Now, we may have to watch the basin in mid-November. Right now, the favorable conditions for tropical development are moving to the Western Pacific. Some models have tried to show that returns to the basin in the Atlantic by mid-month next month. And so we have a couple of areas of interest marked by the Climate Prediction Center for potential development in that time frame. Though the odds are not overly high right now, and speaking climatologically, wind shear does increase as you go throughout the month of November, because that's when hurricane season ends, and that's when, climatologically speaking, conditions are no longer favorable for hurricane development. And so we're likely not going to be seeing anything nearly as strong as we just had with Melissa, and it still remains to be seen if we even get a storm out of this. But we'll watch that for the next few weeks. But for now, we've got a quiet Atlantic, and hopefully it stays that way. Hopefully it is the last storm that we have in the hurricane season, and we don't have to worry about any other systems. Okay, going into the Western Pacific today, I mentioned that all the rising air is moving into the Western Pacific after Melissa, and this is the first spot that we have to watch for development going forward. This is Invest 98W, a little disturbance in the Philippine Sea, just for orientation purposes. This is Guam, this is Palau, and the Southeast Bahamas, Southeast Philippines are sitting here on the western part of this map, and so this is where the disturbance is located. Now, right now, the system is being a little bit sheared. You can see we have the outline of this trough sitting just north of it, and this is likely bringing some westerly shear to the disturbance over the day today. Now, over the coming days, this trough is forecast to weaken, and in its wake, a favorable upper level pattern with light shear is forecast to be put in place, and that will likely aid in development of the system going forward. We can see this happen if we look at the GFS model. I'll go back to the initialization, and you can see that here's the trough sitting here just north of the system, again likely bringing some westerly shear over our system, but over the next few days that weakens away and we are left with now a light shear environment by the time we get to this weekend. And so now the system begins to develop, and the GFS has us forming into a tropical storm as early as Saturday. Now personally, I think this is a little bit aggressive. This is a common bias of the GFS. We saw this several times with Melissa. This is likely another case of that where the GFS is being way too aggressive on the system's development as it becomes a typhoon on this forecast by Sunday. And so the GFS is likely being a little bit too antsy here. And that will become important for the track forecast of this system. You can see on the GFS that by Tuesday of next week, we have the system coming in as a strong typhoon into the central Philippines. And this is important because if we look at a sounding from the GFS, around the time that it makes landfall in the Philippines, we'll see that there is some moderate vertical shear in the mid to upper levels of the atmosphere. And this is a pretty significant layer of shear. So this may cause the system to struggle to intensify much in this time frame. That's another reason why I think the GFS is going a little bit too aggressive here. But also, take a look at the surface flow. It's not all too strong. And what we see in the European model for contrast to this is out to Wednesday afternoon local time. You'll see that the system is sitting here in the central Philippine Sea compared to the GFS by that same time, which is now moving into the South China Sea. And the reasoning for this is that as the storm gets stronger, the thunderstorms tower up higher into the atmosphere. So it's going to feel the effects of this flow more. And so for that reason, the GFS intensifying it stronger, it has a storm on the model going faster than the European model. And that will make a huge difference onto exactly where the system makes landfall in the eventual future. And you can see on the European model that it gets sheared, likely is not able to really intensify all too much from this moderate shear that we have seen on the GFS. And eventually it does intensify, but you'll see that we have changed the landfall spot entirely. We've moved from the central to southeast Philippines to now Luzon by this point because of the short-term trends of the system. Now, exactly which one is going to be correct here, it's hard to say. The GFS does have, again, an aggressive bias. It does tend to overdo convection in storms, which can make the GFS go way too strong on these hurricanes, as there will be some moderate shear here that may keep the system at bay from, say, rapidly intensifying. However, one thing is that the European does often have a weak bias. It does tend to go weak with these systems. Now, I think in this case specifically, I would side more with the European, definitely because of the GFS's bias and this moderate shear. And really, this just remains a thing to watch for the next several days. We're not talking about an imminent strong typhoon coming into the Philippines like the GFS would suggest. It's more so just a disturbance we have to watch over the next couple of weeks as we go in time in the Philippines. As you can see on the European model, this is about 10 days out. In fact, over 10 days out when this makes landfall. So this system may be around for a long time. So we've got plenty of time to watch this and prepare ahead of time. And if any of these two scenarios become probable, we'll talk about that when it gets there. And development this time of year is not all too unexpected. We typically do see some activity in the Philippine Sea this time of year. So we'll watch that for the next few weeks, and we'll also watch whatever the next system potentially in the Atlantic does for the next few weeks. This will likely be my last video on Hurricane Melissa, as by the time this time tomorrow, it will be racing towards the northeast. Again, we may see some hurricane force winds impact Bermuda, but it will be quickly moving off to the northeast and turning post-tropical by that point. Our main focus will likely be in the Western Pacific from here on out. But again, stay safe in all the islands that have been impacted by the hurricane and that are going to be impacted by the hurricane for the next few days. Hopefully the recovery is swift. And that's all that I've got for now. Thanks for watching.